From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Could tension between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un lead us to nuclear war? As tensions ramp up, we discuss what nuclear war looks like. We'll spend the hour with a nuclear war planner who is already famous for another reason, as one of the world's most famous whistleblowers.
My job as a nuclear war planner was to improve the Eisenhower-era plan for strategic nuclear operations in general war with the Soviet Union. That was a low bar because the Eisenhower plan was the worst military plan in the history of warfare.
That's Daniel Ellsberg, one of the world's most well-known whistleblowers. In 1971, he was a high-level defense analyst when he leaked a top-secret report on U.S. involvement in Vietnam to the New York Times and other publications that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. He played a key role in ending the Vietnam War. Few knew Ellsberg was also a Pentagon and White House consultant who drafted plans for nuclear war. In his new book, titled The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, Ellsberg reveals for the first time he also made copies of top-secret documents from his nuclear studies, an entire second set of papers in addition to the Pentagon Papers.
I want to awaken people to the dangers of the nuclear era and the possibility of destroying most life on Earth by a general war, not just by terrorists or rogue nations. They didn't change those dangers just when the Cold War ended, and now that we're back in a new one, they're as intense as they ever were.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's expected to announce today the U.S. will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and initiate a process of moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The move would upend decades of international peace efforts. The announcement has already sparked a massive international backlash, with leaders of Britain, France, Iran, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, the Arab League, and other nations all criticizing the move. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas warned of, quote, the dangerous consequences such a decision would have to the peace process and to the peace, security, and stability of the region and the world, unquote. Palestinians have called for 3 days of rage, protests across the Israeli-occupied territories. Control of Jerusalem is one of the most contested issues between Israelis and Palestinians. The Israeli military seized control of East Jerusalem in 1967 and has occupied it ever since. Palestinians, however, have long seen Jerusalem as the capital of their future country. Since 1967, the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly have passed dozens of resolutions calling for Israel to end its occupation of East Jerusalem. Currently, 86 nations have their embassies in Tel Aviv. No country has an embassy in Jerusalem. This is Pope Francis speaking Tuesday.
Il mio pensiero va ora a Gerusalemme.
My thoughts go out to Jerusalem. In this respect, I cannot hide my deep concern about the situation that has developed in the last days, and in the meantime, I make an urgent appeal to everybody to respect the status quo of the city in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. I pray that wisdom and prudence can prevail to avoid adding new elements of tension in a world scenario already convulsive and scarred by so many cruel conflicts.
Back in the United States, Michigan Democratic Congressmember John Conyers has announced his resignation in the face of multiple accusations of sexual harassment.
I am retiring today, and I want everyone to know how much I appreciate the support, the incredible, undiminished support I've received across the years from my supporters, not only in my district, but across the country as well.
Conyers was speaking on a local Detroit radio station. Congressman Conyers has been the longest-serving current member of the House of Representatives, the longest-serving African-American lawmaker in congressional history. Multiple women have accused Conyers of sexually harassing or groping them, including his former Deputy Chief of Staff, Marion Brown, who settled a sexual misconduct case against Conyers for $27,000. Brown said Conyers invited her to a Chicago hotel room in 2005, where he appeared in his underwear and demanded she touch him sexually. She says she was fired when she refused. This is Brown speaking on NBC's Today Show.
I am taking a risk, and the reason why I'm taking a risk, it is important I want to be a voice. You know, my ancestors, my grandmother, you know, my mother, my daughters, you know, my granddaughter. You know, I want her, when she enters the workforce, long when I'm gone, I want her to not have to, you know, endure sexism and gender inequality. And I want to stand up, and I felt it was worth the risk to stand up for all the women in the workforce that are voiceless. You know, that ordinary women like myself with extraordinary challenges working in the workforce that are dominated by men.
Congressmember John Conyers has endorsed his son, John Conyers III, to replace him. Ian Conyers, the grandson of Conyers' brother, a state senator, will also run for John Conyers' seat in the House of Representatives. President Trump is standing by his endorsement of Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore, who's been accused by at least 9 women of sexually harassing or assaulting them when they were teenagers. One of the women says Moore removed her shirt and pants and touched her over her bra and underwear when she was 14 years old. She says she recalls thinking, "I wanted it over with. I want it out. Please just get this over with. Whatever this is, just get it over," she said. When she was 14, this happened. This is Donald Trump speaking Tuesday.
I think he's going to do very well. We don't want to have a liberal Democrat in Alabama, believe me. We want strong borders. We want stopping crime. We want to have the things that we represent, and we certainly don't want to have a liberal Democrat that's controlled by Nancy Pelosi and controlled by Chuck Schumer. We don't want to have that for Alabama. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
The Republican National Committee has recommitted money and resources to Alabama's special election on December 12th after President Trump tweeted his support for Roy Moore on Monday. Former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon campaigned for Moore in Alabama Tuesday. Meanwhile, late-night show host Stephen Colbert lashed out at Trump Tuesday night for supporting Roy Moore.
Yes, we want stopping crime. We just not want stopping sexual assault.
Moore is grateful for Trump's support, tweeting, "I look forward to fighting alongside the president to MAGA." Of course, that's the sound teenage girls make when they see Roy Moore at the mall. MAGA!
The New York Times has published a massive expose on how disgraced Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein built an industry-wide complicity machine to allow him to perpetrate rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment for decades. Weinstein is now facing criminal investigation in multiple cities after more than 100 women have come forward to accuse him. The expose chronicles how he was able to get away with the violence by building a web of lawyers, agents, journalists, editors, and publishers to help him cover his tracks and intimidate potential accusers. The piece says Hollywood agents and managers repeatedly sent actresses to private meetings with Weinstein, even though they knew about previous assaults. The article also says Weinstein used his political connections to protect himself, often saying during the Obama presidency, quote, "I know the President of the United States. Who do you know?" unquote. A major new investigation by The Intercept says the Trump administration is weighing plans to create a global network of private spies who would report directly to the White House and CIA Director Mike Pompeo. According to the investigation, the proposal was developed by Eric Prince, founder of the now-defunct private mercenary firm Blackwater, and Oliver North, a Marine lieutenant colonel who oversaw the Reagan administration's covert operation to divert money from secret arms sales to Iran to right-wing death squads in Nicaragua, a scheme now known as the Iran-Contra scandal. The Intercept reports Prince and North have pitched the private network of spies as a way for the White House to counter members of the intelligence community, or the so-called deep state, who Trump claims are subverting his presidency. The Intercept also reports the White House is considering another proposal to create a new global kidnapping and rendition program. Eric Prince advised President Trump's transition team. He's also the brother of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. After Trump took office, Prince publicly pitched a plan to privatize the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Another member of Trump's transition team, CIA veteran John McGuire, is also reportedly working with Prince on the private spies and global rendition plan. The Intercept reports Prince may have foreshadowed his new proposal in a 2016 interview on former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon's radio program, in which Prince proposed reviving a version of the CIA's Vietnam War assassination scheme known as the Phoenix program.
2, a Phoenix-like program. Okay, remember the Phoenix program was a root canal done.
You mean Phoenix? This is the Phoenix program. This is the Phoenix. Hang on. This is the Phoenix program in Vietnam.
It was a vicious but very effective kill capture program in Vietnam that destroyed the Viet Cong as a military force. That's what needs to be done to the funders of Islamic terror, and that would be even the wealthy radical Islamist billionaires funding it from the Middle East and any of the other illicit activities they're in.
That was Eric Prince speaking on Steve Bannon's radio program last year. The White House, the CIA, and Eric Prince have all rejected the Intercept's expose. This is White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders speaking Tuesday.
Sarah, one issue that you may have seen this morning is the White House or the President at any level considering creating a global or regional spy network that would circumvent the U.S. intelligence apparatus and serve the President outside of the normal and legally defined intelligence gathering mechanisms?
I'm not aware of any plans for something of that definition or anything similar to that at this time. I'm not going to answer every hypothetical for every single member. Did some random person off the street come in and say something? I don't know, Major. I'm sorry?
The President might consider.
Again, I haven't asked him, but it's not something that's currently in the works.
In Honduras, the political crisis continues as the government is still refusing to release the results of the November 26 presidential election between incumbent President Juan Orlando Hernandez and opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah. The opposition is calling for either a runoff election or a full recount of the vote. Massive protests erupted over the weekend after the government-controlled Electoral Commission stopped tallying votes when the count showed Nasrallah ahead by more than 5 percentage points. After the delay, the Electoral Commission then claimed Hernandez was ahead, sparking protests in which at least 3 people were killed. Earlier this week, the Honduran police mutinied against the government, saying it would no longer enforce a curfew and crackdown against protesters. On Tuesday, a spokesman for the National Police said their strike continues.
The National Police affirms its commitment before Honduran society, and we affirm that we will not repress the Honduran people, given that we are in debt to them, and that is why we are demanding a quick resolution to the political crisis the country is confronting. Second, we outline that we are not pursuing this for a salary increase, as was previously mentioned.
In Yemen, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has intensified its bombing campaign in Yemen following the killing of the former president Ali Abdullah Saleh. He was killed earlier this week by Houthi rebels after he switched sides in the ongoing war and threw his support to the Saudi-led coalition. The Saudi-led coalition has launched dozens of airstrikes against the Houthis in the capital Sana'a today. In Washington, D.C., President Trump's eldest son, Donald Trump Jr., is set to testify to the House Intelligence Committee as part of the special investigation into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia during the 2016 election. This comes as special counsel Robert Mueller has revoked a bail agreement for Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort. Mueller's investigators say while Manafort was out on bail, he worked with a Russian colleague to ghostwrite an editorial promoting Manafort's political work with Ukraine, thereby compromising the fairness of Manafort's upcoming trial. Russia has been banned from the 2018 Winter Games after the International Olympic Committee found its athletes were guilty of systematic doping. The IOC says individual Russian athletes can still apply to compete in February's Games in South Korea, but they will have to participate wearing a neutral uniform. In California, a wildfire in Ventura County, north of Los Angeles, exploded in size Tuesday, burning 55,000 acres, destroying over 150 buildings, forcing 27,000 people to evacuate and knocking out power for 250,000 residents. Meanwhile, new fires have erupted across Southern California, fanned by gusty Santa Ana winds. The fires are so bad they appear in a NASA satellite photograph. In Washington, D.C., dozens of indigenous leaders from Alaska and other parts of North America will hold a protest at the Capitol building today, demanding Congress drop Arctic drilling from their massive rewrite of the U.S. tax code. A little-known provision tucked into the Senate's version of the tax bill would open one of the world's last pristine wildernesses, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, to oil and fracked gas drilling. The Arctic Refuge is rich in biodiversity, home to caribou, polar bears, and musk oxen. It's also been home to indigenous people for thousands of years. You can go to our website, DemocracyNow.org, to see our extended interview on the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And football player Colin Kaepernick accepted Sports Illustrated's Muhammad Ali Legacy Award Tuesday night. Kaepernick helped spark a movement against racism and police brutality across the NFL, the National Football League, after he refused to stand last year for the national anthem before an NFL game. This is Colin Kaepernick speaking after accepting the award from Beyoncé Tuesday night.
I accept this award knowing that the legacy of Muhammad Ali is that of a champion of the people, and one who was affectionately known as the People's Champ. I accept this award not for myself, but on behalf of the people, because if it were not for my love for the people, I would not have protested. And if it was not for the support from the people, I would not be on this stage today. With or without the NFL's platform, I will continue to work for the people, because my platform is the people.
After winning Sports Illustrated's Muhammad Ali Legacy Award Tuesday night, that was Colin Kaepernick speaking. He also spoke at the Nation magazine's gala, where he was honored last night. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. North Korea is warning that U.S. actions are bringing the Korean peninsula to the brink of nuclear war. The warning came Monday as the U.S. and South Korea held massive war games, mobilizing warships, thousands of troops, and some 200 U.S. planes, many of them capable of deploying nuclear bombs. North Korea's foreign ministry issued a statement calling President Trump a, quote, nuclear demon. Earlier this year, North Korea said it would freeze its nuclear weapons program in exchange for an end to U.S. and South Korean war games, an overture rejected by the Trump administration. As tensions between the U.S. and North Korea ramp up, today we're joined for the hour by a nuclear war planner to discuss what nuclear war would look like. He is already well known for another reason as one of the world's most famous whistleblowers. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg was a high-level military analyst when he leaked a top-secret report that detailed the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, including a secret, dramatic escalation of troops and bombings in what looked like an unwinnable war. He photocopied and shared the 7,000-page document with the New York Times and other publications. The report came to be known as the Pentagon Papers and played a key role in ending the Vietnam War.
Well, few know that 10 years before, in 1961, Daniel Ellsberg was a consultant with the Pentagon and the White House, where he drafted plans for nuclear war. In his new book, just out this week, titled The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, Dan Ellsberg reveals for the first time he also made copies of top-secret documents from his nuclear studies, an entire second set of papers in addition to the Pentagon Papers for which he is known. Dan Ellsberg is also the author of a 2003 memoir about the Pentagon Papers in Vietnam called Secrets, in which he did not discuss this other set of papers. He's the subject of the Oscar-nominated documentary, The Most Dangerous Man in America. Dan Ellsberg will be a character in the forthcoming Steven Spielberg film about the Pentagon Papers called The Post. When we come back from our break, we'll speak with Dan Ellsberg for the hour about nuclear war, the plans he drew up, what nuclear war would look like, and his history as the most famous whistleblower in America. Stay with us.
When you attend a funeral, it is sad to think that sooner or later those you love will do the same for you. And you may have thought it tragic, not to mention other adjectives, to think of all the weeping they will do. But don't you worry, no more ashes, no more sackcloth, and an armband made of black cloth will someday nevermore adorn a sleeve. For if the bomb that drops on you gets your friends and neighbors too, there'll be nobody left behind to grieve, and we will all go together when we go. What a comforting fact that is to know. Universal bereavement, an inspiring achievement. Yes, we all will go together when we go. We will all go together when we go, all suffused with an incandescent glow. No one will have the endurance to collect on his insurance. Lloyds of London will be loaded when they go.
We will all go together when we go, by Tom Lehrer. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're joined by Dan Ellsberg for the hour. Yes, known for leaking the Pentagon Papers in 1971, today we learn about something else he did over the years. In fact, decades ago, writing up plans for a nuclear war. His book details this, just out this week, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. So you made copies of top-secret reports for plans about nuclear war years before you copied the Pentagon Papers and released them to the press?
Essentially my notes and sometimes verbatim excerpts, not the entire plans themselves, but on plans that were then unknown to the president, to begin with, to President Kennedy. I briefed his aide, McGeorge Bundy, in his first month in office on the nature of the plans and some of the other problems, like the delegation of authority to theater commanders for nuclear war by President Eisenhower, which was fairly shocking to McGeorge Bundy, even though Kennedy chose to renew that delegation, as other presidents have. But I was given the job of improving the Eisenhower plans, which was not a very high bar, actually, at that time, because they were, on their face, the worst plans in the history of warfare. A number of people who saw them, but very few civilians ever got a look at them. In fact, the Joint Chiefs couldn't really get the targets out of General LeMay at the Strategic Air Command. And there was a good reason for that. They were insane. They called for first strike plans, which was by order of President Eisenhower. He didn't want any plan for a limited war of any kind with the Soviet Union under any circumstances, because that would enable the Army to ask for enormous numbers of divisions or even tactical nuclear weapons to deal with the Soviets. So he required that the only plan for fighting Soviets under any circumstances, such as an encounter in the Berlin corridor, the access to West Berlin, or over Iran, which was already a flashpoint at that point, or Yugoslavia, if they'd gone in. However the war started, with an uprising in East Germany, for example, however it got started, Eisenhower's directed plan was for all-out war in a first initiation of nuclear war, assuming the Soviets had not used nuclear weapons. And that plan called, in our first strike, for hitting every city, actually every town, over 25,000, in the USSR, and every city in China. A war with Russia would inevitably involve immediate attacks on every city in China. And in the course of doing this, pardon, there were no reserves. Everything was to be thrown as soon as it was available. It was a vast trucking operation of thermonuclear weapons over to the USSR, but not only the USSR. The captive nations, the East Europe satellites in the Warsaw Pact, were to be hit in their air defenses, which were all near cities, their transport points, their communications of any kind. So they were to be annihilated as well. I couldn't believe when I saw these that the Joint Chiefs actually had ever calculated how many people they would actually kill in this course. In fact, colonels who were friends of mine in the air staff told me they'd never seen an actual figure for the total casualties. We had exact figures of the number of targets and how many planes would be needed and every sort of thing, many calculations, but not victims. So I drafted a question which the aide to McGeorge Bundy, Bob Comer, sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And the question was, in the event of your carrying out your general nuclear war plans, which were first strike plans, how many will die? First, I asked, in the USSR and China alone. In the thought that, by the way, they'd be embarrassed to say, we have to have more time. We've never really calculated that. I was wrong, and my friends were wrong in the Air Force. They came back with an answer very quickly. 325 million people in the USSR and China alone. Well, then I asked, all right, how many altogether? And a few days later, 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, another 100 million in West Europe, our allies, from our own strikes, by fallout, depending on which way the wind blew. And however the wind blew, a third 100 million in adjoining countries, neutral countries like Austria and Finland, or Afghanistan then, Japan, northern India, and so forth. A total of 600 million people. That was a time, by the way, when the population of the world was 3 billion. And that was an underestimate of their casualties, 100 holocausts. It was very clear that they hadn't included, I hadn't asked actually, what would Russian retaliation be against us and against West Europe. They were thought at that time, wrongly, to have hundreds of weapons against the US, but they did have hundreds of weapons against West Europe. No question West Europe would go under any circumstances. If we were defending West Europe, Germany, for example, we were planning to destroy the continent in order to save it. 600 million, that was 100 holocausts. And when I held the piece of paper in my hand that had that figure, that they'd sent out unembarrassedly, proudly to the president, here's what we will do, I thought, this is the most evil plan that has ever existed. It's insane. The weapons, the machinery that will carry this out, this is no hypothetical plan like Herman Kahn might have conceived at the Doomsday Machine that he thought up at the Rand Corporation as my colleague. This was an actual war plan for how we would use the existing weapons, many of which I'd seen already that time.
Well, Dan Ellsberg, the colossal carnage that they were envisioning as a result of this first strike use was made doubly worse, as you reveal, by the fact that the image that we have that the president is the one who holds the switch or has his hand on the button is not true. That many people have the capacity to initiate a nuclear war. If you could talk about that as well.
To start with, even if it were only the president, no one man, really no one nation, should have the ability even to threaten or to carry out 100 holocausts at his will. That machinery should never have existed, and it does exist right now, and every president has had that power, and this president does have that power. But the recent discussions of that, which emphasize his sole authority to do that, don't take account of the fact that he has authority to delegate. And he has delegated. Every president has delegated. I don't know the details of what President Trump has done or since the Cold War. Every president in the Cold War, right through Carter and Reagan, had delegated, in fact, to theater commanders in case communications were cut off. That means that the idea that the president is the only one with sole power to issue an order that will be recognized as an authentic, authorized order is totally false. How many fingers are on buttons? Probably no president has ever really known the details of that. I knew in '61, for example, that Admiral Harry D. Felt in CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, for whom I worked as a researcher, had delegated that to 7th Fleet, down to various commanders, and they in turn had delegated down to people. So when you say how many altogether feel authorized if their communications are cut off, and that happened part of every day in the Pacific when I was there. Communications got better, but the delegations never changed. We've never allowed it to be possible that an enemy could paralyze our retaliation by hitting our president or our command and control. And neither did the Russians. When President Carter and then President Reagan advertised the fact that their plans emphasized decapitation, hitting Moscow above all, which the French and British always planned to do, by the way, with their smaller forces. And when that became clear, the Russians instituted what they called a dead hand, a perimeter system in Russian, which assured that if Moscow was destroyed, other commanders would have the power and would be told to launch their strikes. There was even a plan to do that automatically by computer, as a number of our military always recommended, to make the whole thing computerized, as in the Doomsday Machine of Herman Kahn and Stanley Kubrick. But generally, they allow for lower-level majors, colonels, to decide the time has come, we've lost our commanders, the time has come to go. That's almost certainly true in North Korea right now.
So when you heard about President Trump having that meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summertime, the one where allegedly, I mean, Rex Tillerson has not confirmed or denied this, he called the president an effing moron. That apparently was in response to Trump asking 3 times in that meeting, if we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them?
Well, he had asked that allegedly, according to Joe Scarborough and others, to people during the campaign a year earlier. And an answer to that, of course, is you will use them. And he is using them right now. It's not a question of whether the president might use them. He's using them the way you use a gun when you point it at somebody in a confrontation, whether or not you pull the trigger. And both Trump and Kim are using their weapons in that encounter right now, as many presidents have done, as I discovered later, as there's a chapter in the book of a couple dozen, perhaps 3 dozen cases, mostly in secret, where presidents have actually pointed the gun, aside from wearing it ostentatiously on their hip at all times, as in NATO. I think one of our commanders just said, oh, we use the weapons every day, every hour of the day, which is true. We use them on the hip. But at the moment, they're being pointed. And they're being pointed by 2 people who are giving very good imitations of being crazy. That's dangerous. I hope they're pretending. They might be pretending, but to pretend to be crazy with nuclear weapons is not a safe game. It's a game of chicken, nuclear chicken.
Well, this is an excerpt of President Kennedy's address to the nation at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear war.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
So that was President Kennedy. Can you talk about your own experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962? Talk about what you were doing. This is before you released the Pentagon Papers, years later.
I listened to the president on October 22nd. I remember announcing that there were missiles in Cuba. And I called up my friend, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Harry Rowan, later president of RAND, and asked, do you need some help out there? And he said, get on the next plane, which I did. I flew out to Washington then the next morning early, got into the Pentagon, the day actually that the blockade was instituted, the day before, actually. And given the task, for example, since I was a command and control specialist of, that's how I got into nuclear planning, what can the Russians do with 30-some missiles on Cuba? Well, they can hit Moscow. I'm sorry, they can hit Washington. They can hit Washington, which is what our Joint Chiefs would do, and they could hit various other places. And that, I knew, would not paralyze our response. It would only make it quickly carried out against all the cities in Russia and China and so forth. It would do them no good, but that's probably what they would do and so forth. I worked during that week. Some nights I slept in the office of Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Nitze, and on a couch in his office while I was on several task forces working for the Executive Committee, the ExComm, of the National Security Council. Now, the next year, I spent studying a great deal on that crisis with higher than top secret access on the whole, and yet I didn't learn many of the things that are most important about that crisis, which have taken decades and decades to come out of secrecy. For one thing, I've concluded, contrary to what I thought at the time, that both President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were determined not to carry out the threats they were making of armed conflict. Compared to the North Korean crisis right now. Imagine that both sides have decided they are absolutely not going to armed conflict. They're only gesturing and breastbeating and trying to get the other side to back down. That's what was happening in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, to make the threats credible, Khrushchev was maneuvering submarines within the range of our forces, armed with nuclear torpedoes we didn't know they had at all, and they were subject to mock depth charges to bring them to the surface, with our Navy not knowing that they were facing submarines that could blow them all out of the water. Kennedy, on the other hand, was moving troops exactly like those exercises. As a matter of fact, we had done exercises just before the crisis broke of invading Cuba, not named Cuba. The enemy they were against was announced to the papers as Ortsak, which, as Khrushchev inferred cleverly, was Castro spelled backwards. He said, yes, that was a game we used to play when I was a kid, said Khrushchev. So here we were threatening to invade Cuba. It was not a way to keep the Cubans from acquiring a deterrent force, just as our exercises of invading North Korea, going on right now, essentially, don't seem a very well-chosen way to get Kim Jong-un to give up his deterrent capability in North Korea. But that's what we were doing.
Did you say
the other thing I learned was that in the course of these maneuvers, we came within a hair's breadth of blowing the world up, of having the plans I've just described go into action. A nuclear submarine, I should say a submarine that was armed with nuclear torpedoes, had the two top commanders who thought they were going to go down, actually, as a result of these mock depth charges that were actually meant to force them to the surface. The commander, Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo armed and ready for action against the destroyers or the cruiser. The second in command, whose assent was needed, agreed with him, and they were ready to go. It happened that a commodore of the several submarines in the area was on that sub rather than some other one. It could have been one of the others, but he was there. And since he was the Commodore, his assent was also needed. And he said no. And thanks to that man, Vasily Arkhipov, we didn't blow a cruiser out of the water and cause the nuclear explosion that Kennedy had already announced would cause an all-out attack on the Soviet Union.
And you say that you only learned years later that Khrushchev himself had again delegated authority to these folks to start a war?
Some of the things we learned relatively recently in the 90s and confirmed just in this century were that Khrushchev had not only managed to get nuclear warheads to the medium-range missiles that he had put in Cuba, which, by the way, were the exact counterpart of what Kim Jong-un is trying to do now. Khrushchev had decided that his ability to destroy our allies directly with his medium-range missiles in Europe, which we could not find and destroy, mobile missiles, he could kill 100 million and more in Europe. That didn't seem to be phasing us in Berlin. It wasn't getting us out of Berlin. It wasn't getting us determined to keep access to Berlin, even though doing that would force us to go to tactical nuclear war. So he said, I have to have missiles in range of the U.S. And so he moved missiles to Cuba, medium-range missiles that would be in range of the U.S. Kim does not have a Cuba now to put, and probably couldn't anyway in the case of Cuba. So he's building ICBMs that can reach the U.S., even though he can already destroy entirely our ally in South Korea and in Japan. So he's doing what Khrushchev did, and it's dangerous, as it was for Cuba, for Khrushchev at that time. Okay. Moreover, we had no idea at that time, though it was the most surveilled island in the history of the world. U-2s and satellites were flying over it, and even low-level reconnaissance planes that managed not to discover that he had put tactical nuclear weapons, short-range weapons in Cuba. We didn't know they were there. And moreover, he'd done what we thought was unthinkable for a Russian dictator who wanted central control of everything. He and his presidium had delegated the use of those weapons against our invasion fleet to the local commanders. Now, that's almost necessary tactically. You can't wait on Moscow if an invasion fleet is coming at you. But we didn't think he would ever do that. His theory was, Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was a very smart man, actually, and his theory was, and the presidium theory, they can't reach Miami. These are only tactical missiles, short-range missiles. They can only blow the invasion fleet out of the water, kill 100,000 Americans, and let it stop there. It won't escalate further. When McNamara learned that 30 years later, he said, that's insane to think that we could lose 100,000 men and not go to all-out war against the Soviet Union. And it was insane. Kim Jong-un seems to have a very similar belief that he could initiate war against our forces in South Korea and keep it limited. That's insane. But it's no more insane than our plans to initiate nuclear war against Russia, which would kill nearly everyone in the world.
We're going to go to break, then come back to our conversation. We're talking with Daniel Ellsberg. Yes, he leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971, but his new book is called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And yes, that is what he did as well. He was involved in planning for nuclear war. Ellsberg reveals he also made copies of top-secret reports on plans for nuclear war. Stay with us.
Yes, yes, Lion. We don't really need. We don't really need. No. There's no time to beat around the bush. All the world is living in fear. The consequence of great disaster zone. The thought alone I cannot bear. And now that war is raised its ugly head. Slave for power, paints the city red. I isolate the status quo. We no want weapons, no, of mass destruction. Move ya. We no want, no. We no want weapons. We no want, no. We no want, no. We no want none in the north and none in the south and none in the west and east. Cannot be in the Prince of Peace, Lord. We no want no boom.
No More Weapons by Steel Pulse. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we're spending the hour with Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971. His new book is The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Ellsberg reveals he also made copies of top-secret reports on plans for nuclear war. I want to turn to a clip from the film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Ellsberg has joked that it could be a documentary. The black comedy was released in 1964, just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The film centers on a nuclear crisis that begins when a U.S. bomber plane loaded with nuclear weapons is on a routine flight pattern near the Soviet Union at the time, when it receives orders to carry out Wing Attack Plan R. That's nuclear war from lunatic General Jack D. Ripper, using the pre-delegated authority given to him in case of an attack on Washington. Much of the film takes place in the war room, where the president meets his top Pentagon advisors who want to proceed with the attack despite his hesitation. They hit a snag when the Soviet ambassador informs them of Russia's new weapon, a doomsday machine that'll destroy the entire world if they're attacked. So in this scene from the film, we're in the war room when the president's advisor, Dr. Strangelove, is asked to describe the doomsday machine based on a study he commissioned from the so-called Bland Corporation.
But how is it possible for this thing to be triggered automatically and at the same time impossible to untrigger?
Mr. President, it is not only possible, it is essential. That is the whole idea of this machine, you know. Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack. And so, because of the automated and irrevocable decision-making process which rules out human meddling, the doomsday machine is terrifying, it's simple to understand, and completely credible and convincing.
Gee, I wish we had one of them doomsday machines.
That's a clip from the 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove, about the Doomsday Machine, which is also the title of our guest Dan Ellsberg's new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Your colleague at the the Rand Corporation is the one who coined that term?
Herman Kahn invented that idea. And he said, by the way, that it killed so many people, everyone actually, that no one ever would produce such a machine. He said it doesn't exist and it never would exist. He said that in 1959 and 60. He was wrong. It did exist at that time, and it's existed ever since. We didn't know that for another 20 years. We didn't know that the weapons we had targeted on all these cities, and by the way, I tried to change that under Secretary McNamara. I said, have a withhold option against all the cities here. You know, why are you killing the cities here, either in retaliation or least of all in a first strike, which would force them, or which would cause them certainly to hit our cities inevitably, which they probably will do anyway. But this gives them no incentive to refrain from our cities, whatever. Why are we hitting Moscow? How do you possibly ever get the war stopped? How can you possibly get it limited? How could they surrender or the war end in any way if you hit their central command? And that seemed to make some sense, and there was a withhold option against that, never implemented. When Cheney came in years later, he was amazed to discover how many weapons were still targeted on Moscow, and we're talking about hundreds here, which seemed crazy to me. Anyway, the system, however, as I've already said, they did plan that they were going to kill, I said 600 million, but actually they weren't including the effects of fire. They never have, because it's too incalculable in the weather and the inflammable materials and so forth. Actually, that's the biggest effect of thermonuclear weapons. So the number would really have been at that time well over 1 billion, plus the Soviet retaliation against Europe. So we're talking about over 1 billion people, a third of the Earth's population at that time. And I've actually heard Edward Teller, one of the sources of Dr. Strangelove, fictional Dr. Strangelove, the father of the H-bomb Teller, say, at most, thermonuclear weapons could cause the deaths of 1/3 of the population, very close to what the Joint Chiefs had said. I thought of that as the glass 2/3 full when I heard him say that. But the fact is, he was wrong. And Kahn was wrong. Nobody's perfect. In fact, it would be 3/3. The fact is that the weapons on these cities, which continued always, despite the supposed withholding option, to be targeted on military targets in the cities. The cities would burn, nevertheless, and not only would there be fire, that were not in the calculations, there would be smoke, surprise. And the firestorms that would be caused by these simultaneous widespread fires, as in the Tokyo firestorm of March 9th and 10th, 1945, there were only 3 so-called firestorms in World War II, Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, where the fires were so widespread that they caused the column of air to rise abruptly very high into the stratosphere. And what had not been calculated before, till 1983, was that the millions and millions, possibly 100 million tons of smoke and black soot would be lofted into the stratosphere where it would not be rained out ever, and it would spread quickly around the world, causing a blanket that would destroy, or rather absorb, most of the sunlight from reaching the Earth, 70% of the sunlight, killing all the harvests worldwide and preventing any vegetation, starving everyone on Earth, essentially. Nearly everyone, let me correct that. Carl Sagan, when he first was reporting this in 1983, more than a third of a century ago, said extinction was possible. The latest calculations show no, extinction is very unlikely. We're so adaptable. We can live in tip of New Zealand eating mollusks, some millions of people, but 98% or 99% of the people will go near extinction, close enough to be called a doomsday machine. And that is what both US and Russia have still on hair triggers, with the delegation, with launch on warning, with ICBMs on both sides that are vulnerable to attack by the other, and therefore have the incentive to use them or lose them if there's warning of an attack on the way. Now, false warnings have occurred on both sides repeatedly and gone into several minutes. In 1995, several years after the Cold War was over, Premier Yeltsin, for the first time, either side, was shown his briefcase and the buttons that he would push to launch nuclear warning because of what was, in fact, a Norwegian weather rocket that was mistaken for a rocket that might be headed at Moscow for decapitation. And he hesitated, Yeltsin, at that time long enough that the missile would have arrived, and they decided it was a false alarm. If he had not, we wouldn't be here, because the nuclear winter resulting from the attack on one side or both would have produced smoke that long ago would have starved us and nearly everyone else on Earth.
So when you hear the news accounts now of the threats of North Korea and the response of the president that he'll rain fire and fury on the Korean Peninsula, what's your reaction to the nature of the debate now? Because I would think that back in the 80s, the public consciousness of nuclear winter, of the dangers of nuclear weapons, seemed a lot greater throughout the United States than it is today.
Well, these are the first threats that any American president, and American presidents have made many nuclear threats, as we said earlier in the past. These are the first ones since the Cuban Missile Crisis more than half a century ago against the nuclear weapons state. Harry Truman made nuclear threats 67 years ago against North Korea. But North Korea wasn't a nuclear state then. And by the way, we didn't need nuclear weapons to bring fire and fury like the world had never seen, except in Tokyo and Dresden and Hamburg. We burned North Korea to the ground without using nuclear weapons at that time. Left not a stick of man-made structure left standing in North Korea. So they all remember that. If they're President Trump's age or older, actually, he was 4 at the time, but that was indelible memory. They can believe we would do that. But now they have nuclear weapons. If they were smart, they wouldn't send them back at us, because that would be sheer suicide for them. Every man, woman, and child in North Korea, as he's implied, would be killed. Should we count that they won't do that? That they won't retaliate to our strike? No. He's not going to take his nuclear weapons entirely out of Korea as we have these exercises. He thinks he would be crazy to do that. It would be suicidal, and that's not the kind of crazy he is. The kind he is the kind we are, which is nuclear weapons are to be met or even preempted with nuclear weapons. That striking first is better than striking second, and striking second is better than not striking at all. It's crazy, but we've shown that kind of craziness for 70 years.
You have called for whistleblowers to come forward. I wanted to play a clip of, well, you have said that the Army whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, who is now out of jail, who spent 7 years behind bars and leaked more than 700,000 classified files and videos to WikiLeaks about U.S. foreign policy in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Manning had been sentenced to 35 years in prison in 2013 after she was convicted under the World War I era Espionage Act. In January, President Obama commuted her sentence shortly before leaving office. She was the longest-held whistleblower in U.S. history. After her release, Manning spoke with ABC News about her decision to become a whistleblower.
Getting all this information, and it's just death, destruction, mayhem, and eventually you just stop. I stopped seeing just statistics and information, and I started seeing people.
There are those who say you may have been motivated to get the information into the public sphere, but you might have also given it to our enemies.
Right, but I have a responsibility to the public. You know, it's not just about, we all have a responsibility.
So that was Chelsea Manning. Dan Ellsberg, you've called in your book for other people to, in positions, to raise the alarm about nuclear weapons. You visited Ed Snowden in Russia. What kind of information would you like to see released now?
Well, let me say, first of all, Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden are heroes of mine. And at the same time, I can say I identify more with them than with any other people on Earth, because they went through the same process of challenge that I did and made the same kind of decisions. I would say to people who were in her position or Ed Snowden's position, especially in a high position right now, if you are aware of documents, and I'm certain these documents exist in the Pentagon, in CIA, in the White House, that show the true scale of the horrors, the damage, the devastation that would occur if President Trump were to carry out his threats of armed conflict, armed action against this nuclear state, against North Korea. I'm sure, by the way, that these estimates exist.
Do you think it's going to be North Korea? Do you think it could be Russia? I know, I mean, given
see,
all the controversy, or Iran?
Yeah, of course, any of those, if there was a chance of initiating nuclear war, as President Trump is moving us toward, actually, in Iran, by talking about revoking the deal and probably restarting their nuclear program. The chance of war with Iran would erupt immediately, as was true half a century ago when I was in RAND and in the Pentagon. We always considered that initiating nuclear war in the case of conflict in Iran was essential. We couldn't match the Russians in that period. Okay, if you knew this, consider revealing that to Congress and the press, whatever the cost to you, even if the cost is what I faced, life in prison, what Chelsea Manning was charged with, actual possible life in prison. A world's worth of lives are at stake here. And I would say do what I wish I had done in '61, which was put out those documents then, or in '64, before the Pentagon War actually got started in a big way. Don't wait. As Martin Luther King says, there is such a thing as too late. And he talked of the fierce urgency of now. This crisis right now may awaken people in the Pentagon and in the public to the dangers we've been living with secretly for so long.
We have to leave it there. Dan Ellsberg, thanks so much for being with us. His new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Ellsberg revealing he also made copies of top-secret reports on plans for nuclear war. And this last piece of news, Time magazine has announced the 2017 Person of the Year goes to the women who have spoken out against sexual assault and harassment, sparking an international movement. Time magazine calls the group the Silence Breakers. It includes Hollywood actresses, journalists, farm workers, and hotel cleaners. Time's announcement this morning comes after President Trump claimed he was in the running for Time Person of the Year. President Trump has been accused of sexual assault by at least 16 women. And that does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Noreen Shea, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Masood, Trina Ndura, Mel Ahmed. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.